Hey guys, in this video I'm going to talk about adding some fictional details to our sword and also doing research for those maybe fantasy or made up elements. So I decided on a kopis, like a Greek kopis, as the type of sword I would use. And I need to know why it is I'm designing this thing, why I chose this one, what sort of fictional world that this is going to fit into, because when you're doing visual design for entertainment especially, you are storytelling. You are storytelling with the objects, with their surfaces, with their details. You're trying to tell some story about this thing and how it fits with a narrative possibly or a character. So a lot of that can be done with just the details of the object. The first thing I did was just look up a Greek kopis in Wikipedia once more to see what sort of use this object was being put to. It turns out that it was a military sword that was often just kind of a general purpose hacking implement. Another thing that I didn't show in the last one is when you look up swords, they do different kinds of damage in different ways, and this one is one that chops or slashes as opposed to stabs because it's got the cutting edge on one side. But that leads me to this. We need to answer these kind of questions for whatever it is we're designing. Not all of them are very important, but some of them are. So first, what is it? I mean, it's a sword, right? A Greek kopis sword. There might be some other part to that answer. Like you might want a sword which is also magical, a sword which is broken, a sword which is, I don't know, brand new prototype sword or something like that, or some fantasy world that might be a sword that absorbs souls or drinks blood or who knows what. In my case, it's just this sword, like this historic sword. But answer that question however you want. The rest of these details can follow. One pretty early on question you should be asking is, why are you drawing or painting this in particular, right? Is there something about it that excites you? Is there something about it that interests you? Is there something about it that's going to be useful for some other story or purpose? Like, really, the reason I'm drawing or painting this is as a good example of design. Like, that's the honest answer for me, is that I wouldn't normally draw or paint this thing in particular. I'm doing it as an example of how to do this design process. But your answer hopefully is going to be a different one. It might be something like, I think I could draw this easily, or I think I could paint this without breaking my wrist or something. That's fine, be honest. But this answer is going to influence the other ones. Like, for instance, if I'm trying to set a good example of design, maybe I should add some fantasy element to this what is it answer, because that's often going to be a part of design. So maybe I'll do that. When does this story take place? If it's historic, can you set it in a century? If it's not historic, can you at least set it in a position in a narrative, like at the beginning of the story, they inherit this sword from their dying parent or something. At least that sets it in a when that has some context. So I'll say that this sword is being issued new to a new recruit. So that's not saying that this is historical. This is saying in a story, this is the position that that sword is going to be encountered, which means it's going to be pretty new looking, not heavily used, not damaged or scratched or blood stained, is what that would mean. Okay. And we'll say, where does this story take place? Does it take place in the country of origin of this real thing? Does it take place in a fantasy world? Does it take place in an alternate fiction or something like that? So you can answer this however you want, but it's going to influence what you do with your object. We'll say that this takes place in a fantasy bird society. So these people, right, these soldiers are birds. I just thought of it because of this kind of neck up here. And this is the sword that they carry on them as they fly around and fight each other for some reason. So this is going to take place in a fantasy bird society with military. There you go. Okay. Who does this belong to? This would be a new recruit, because I did kind of answer that earlier. Is there anything special about them, though? Is this a new recruit who is actually royalty who is serving in the military because of the required part of their public duty? Is this a recruit who was poor and disadvantaged, and being in the military is probably going to be the biggest power spike that they've ever had in their life, and now they're actually going to feel like a human being, or like a bird, fully fledged societal bird for the first time? Is this new recruit someone who is cocky and comes from a military family and has a lot of confidence that they know exactly what is going to go down? So maybe they are polishing and sharpening their sword when the other ones don't quite know what to do with it yet, or customizing it in some way. So we need to answer this question as accurately as we can, so that we have extra details. I'll say, who's this recruit? A new recruit. I'll go with the royalty one. Who is young royalty doing their civic duty as expected. So this sword might have indications that it is specifically made for this special person, although it should in other ways be your kind of standard issue equipment. How is this object being used? So this points towards degradation or damage, or a long history of handing down from one person to the other. Is this an inherited object versus a newly made object? So let's pivot a little bit. I've been saying this is a brand new thing. This is a ceremonial inherited object used by the royal lineage in combat training. So that's going to mean that this object is older and in poorer shape than the other recruits are likely to get, but it also is going to be made of hardier materials and maybe embellished or embroidered in some way, which gives me a little bit of inspiration in how I might design the details of this thing. So that's a really good start also. It didn't take us that long. You can change these answers, but don't change them past the point of starting to do your design. Get these locked in as soon as you can, like probably just review it. A Greek kopis sword-ish, right? We'll say with royal and bird elements to remind myself. Why do you want to draw or paint this? As a good example of design. When does the story take place? It's being issued to a new recruit. We know he's special, but that's kind of answered later on. Where does this story take place? In a fantasy bird society with military and apparently a royal society. Who does this belong to? A new recruit who is a young royalty doing their civic duties expected of them. And how is this object used? This is a ceremonial inherited object used by the royal lineage in combat training. So it's going to have nicks and scratches and probably be polished and repaired also, but definitely not brand new. Okay, so that's a good place to start. What do I do with that information? Well, now I start to look for other kinds of reference, like royal swords or combat training swords. So let's do that. How about I do royal sword? What's that going to return? Now, these won't be necessarily kopis swords, but that's okay. I don't need to be that specific. I'm just looking for what sort of embellishments are typical. So it looks like mottos are typical, and design work with patterns, embroidery and engravement. So embroidery on any leather or cloth elements like the grip, and engraving on the metal. So I'll toss that in my folder, even though it's the completely wrong type of sword. Here's like an anime character and some kind of replica plastic sword. If it helps you, that's cool. Here's an old looking sword with some engraving. So I like that. I'm going to toss that in because that fits a little bit better with my idea. This one appears to have like even a crown on it, which is cute, but a little bit silly for my taste. Same thing here. Like this shape, by the way, I can tell had to have been like machine made or like die pressed or something. It's very unlikely this would have been a handmade element just because of how detailed it is. I could be wrong, but that's the impression I get. It doesn't look old to me. Here's like I think that's from like World of Warcraft or something like that. I like these little details here. I'm going to toss a few of these in. I'm also kind of on the lookout for avian or bird elements in these designs because that would help a bit. There's oftentimes like religious iconography, it looks like, because that's a big part of like the history of Europe. Combination of like wood and metal here. So I don't know how long it's going to take me to browse and find all these details, but you got to put in the effort. You got to put in the time to find those things, and try different nouns, try different descriptive words, and who knows what you'll find. Let's try a like training sword. What do I get for a training sword? Probably like plastic or wood or blunted, because that's typically, you don't want people who are just training to like kill each other. There's like a bamboo sword. Here's like wooden ones. So I may want like, here's actually, that's pretty close to a kopis also, a Filipino Kali, which is wooden instead of being metal. So there's an idea. I could make this entire thing out of wood instead of metal, or I could blunt the cutting edge or something, because this is meant for training and not for killing. Or this could literally just be a very bloodthirsty society in which you train with a real sword right off the bat and you might kill other recruits. I'd have to think about that and possibly answer that question in my notes, so that I knew where I was going with it. But interesting that a training sword kind of returns this sort of thing. What if I type in something weird like bird sword? What do I get? I mean, decorative elements like a flying bird as the hilt. Cool. Let's throw that in here. Or very, very fantasy looking illustrations, which I don't really want to pursue. Here's a bird with a sword, right? Different ways of people handling. I kind of like these elements. I'll toss those in there. They also do kind of look a little bit royal. Here's a bird off the side, right? Here's a nice photoshopped owl with a top hat and a katana, which I love. You never quite know what you're going to see, and it won't all be useful, but like here's a bird head grip for what looks like a cane sword or something. Yeah, I mean, you just kind of got to do a lot of research and find out what is out there. What do you want to use? Here's a wooden bird head, so that's good. That kind of ties into that idea that I had earlier. This one's like a dagger with sort of kind of scroll work or decorative surface engraving all over the thing like that. We'll toss that in there. This might happen. Like if you're just dragging them off the internet, you might get things that are named similarly. So I'll say don't copy. I'll just rename this to Copis, and now I should be able to drag it in. Or you could save it temporarily on the desktop, rename it, and drag it in there. Okay, so this is like the second stage of this research. Now I've got the basic object and some information about how swords work. I've got some information and inspiration about the kind of specific storytelling elements that I'm looking for. And if I wanted something magical, I should probably think of that here as well. I think I'm going to avoid that for this example because this is good enough for like fantasy. But I think you would know how to like look up, let's just say, for instance, it was on fire. So let's do burning sword. What do we get? Okay, we get ones where the metal is heated up, right? We get ones where their metal is heated up and there are flames coming off of the surface of the thing in lots of different ways. Sometimes the metal doesn't appear affected. Sometimes the metal is completely constructed out of flames. And you could just do as much research as you want to get the particular look that you're after. This one even looks like it's a feather and it's on fire. Neat. You know what? I'll save that one. What the heck? I don't really want my sword to be on fire, but the fact that the blade is a feather is kind of a neat trick that someone has thought of. So if this was the way that you wanted to go, you could see how all of these different circumstances, here's Hellboy, from comics, but someone's personal take on it, have handled the problem of like burning metal or burning swords or swords of flame or whatever, and maybe you want to use one of those approaches. There's nothing wrong with doing this. There are going to be very few completely unique approaches, and you really shouldn't even care about coming up with a completely unique approach to your design. Your design is going to be put together out of pieces culturally, even if you didn't do this research. It would have been put together pieces that were in your head already. You have watched fiction, you have read stories or listened to stories, you have played video games, you have seen swords. You are going to put together your design out of that without doing this research. At least this way, you are now freshly putting brand new inspiration into your head before you do your design so that it can be as unique and interesting as possible. Okay? So in the next video, I will actually start to lay down some basic shapes for our sword in thumbnails.